Okay, well, let me welcome you to the third and final day of Philosophy, Disability and Social Change 5, fifth year we've been running this. My name is Jonathan Wolfe. I'm from the Blavatnik School of Government in Oxford, who are hosting this event. I'm a white man, grey hair in my 60s. I've got horn rim spectacles. I'm wearing a blue top and I'm sitting in front of quite a packed set of bookshelves. Let me pass straight over to Shelley, who has put the program together. I'm just the host. Shelley is the organizer, and Shelley will tell us a bit more about the day.
Good morning. Welcome to the third day of the fifth edition of the series, Philosophy, Disability, and Social Change. I'm very happy to be with all of you. I am a white woman. I have short asymmetrical hair and large plastic glasses. On the wall to my right behind me, there is a clock, and on my left and on the ceiling to my left, there's a fan, ceiling fan. I'm very happy to have organized this series with Jonathan. We've worked well together, and the Blavatnik School has been very generous, and Jamie, of course, has been wonderful. I didn't want to say too much, but I did want to give us, I wanted to point out that tomorrow, December 14th, is the first anniversary of the publication of the Bloomsbury Guide to Philosophy of Disability, which many of the participants of this conference have contributed to. So I thought we might have we might engage in an exercise over the course of today's sessions, and maybe think about think about whether and to what extent anything has changed or moved in the discipline since the publication of the book last year. I've noted a few things myself, but I'd like to know what others have seen. And so maybe over the course of the day, we can just sort of like blend that into our discussion, or maybe we can talk about it a bit more in the last session of the day. But that's just something I thought would be interesting to do. Okay, so I'm going to hand it over to Tracy so that she can begin the first session. Thank you.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending where you are today. Welcome to this session, Eating Politics, on day 3 of the 5th iteration of Philosophy, Disability, and Social Change. I'm Tracy Isaacs. I am an older woman of color with short gray hair. I'm wearing a blue top with a green jacket and a little chain link necklace, and my background on Zoom is blurred today. I am a professor in the Department of Philosophy at Western University in London, Ontario, and we are on the traditional lands here of the Anishinaabeg, the Haudenosaunee, the Lenape-Wak, and Chinongton peoples, on lands connected with the London Township and Sombra Treaties of 1796 and the Dish with One Spoon Covenant Wampum. I appreciate being asked to chair this session. I work on collective responsibility, and I'm currently devoting my full attention to applied collective responsibility in the area of food ethics, with a focus on strategic arguments in support of veganism. And Shelley has been a great supporter of my project, and she engages regularly with my blog posts on vegan practically. So thank you, Shelley. And I'm sure that's why I'm sharing this session, which I'm very excited to be doing today. How we have set it up today is each speaker, we're going in the order of the program. So it'll be Megan, then Lori, then Kristin, who I'm about to introduce them all, actually. And then they'll present for about 30 minutes. Then we will have about 15 minutes of questions right after each talk, and then there should still be time, a little bit of time at the end of the entire session for open questions if anything comes up, or if people want to make connections and so forth. So as I said, the topic today is eating politics, and our speakers, please remember to give a short description of yourself. Speakers are Megan Dean from Michigan State, speaking on an anti-dieting defense of dietary restraint, combating fat phobia without ableism about eating. Lori Gruen from Wesleyan, speaking on eating disabled animals, and Kristin Rodier from Athabasca, speaking on fatness and the abnormal fatness and the abnormal, disciplining bodies in the age of Ozempic. And so now I will turn it over to Megan.
Well, thank you so much, and thank you, Shelley, for organizing this excellent event, and to our generous host, Jonathan. I am a white woman with short brown hair and glasses, and I have an imposing wooden piece of furniture behind me here. And here are my title slide, an anti-dieting defense of dietary restraint. And I have a picture of some different paper plates of different shapes and sizes on a blue background. I will have just one or two other pictures on the slides that I'll make sure I describe as we go along. And the subtitle for my talk is Combating Fat Phobia. I added and Healthism, because I think they're connected here in the context of my talk, without ableism about eating. So I work at Michigan State University, which occupies the ancestral, traditional, and contemporary lands of the Anishinaabe Three Fires Confederacy of Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi peoples. But I'm currently in Mi'kma'ki, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. You can find my slides at my website, meganadeen.com/conference-talks. They're there if you'd like to download them or just view them. And I think that's all the preliminaries. So let me get started. Okay. So today I'm going to talk about dietary restraint, which is actually a technical term in the scientific literature on diet. But in order to make that interesting to you all, I wanted to start with some healthist and fat phobic assumptions about good eating that sort of motivate thinking about dietary restraint in this context. So by healthist, I mean healthism is roughly the view that health is unquestionably valuable and that all individuals should prioritize it above everything else. And by phobic, here I am referring to fat phobia, which is fear, hatred, or loathing of fatness, fat bodies, and fat people. So here are some healthist fat phobic assumptions about good eating. Good eating should be aimed at health above all else. Fatness is incompatible with good health. So fatness is a clear sign that somebody's eating unhealthily, that they are unhealthy. And that assumption in a healthist context can be used to justify fat phobia, where we would be right to fear or hate fatness because it is unhealthy if we assume that being unhealthy is so bad. And then finally, the assumption that weight loss dieting is a form of healthy eating and it will help a dieter become healthier by helping them lose weight. So there are excellent critiques, powerful critiques of all of these assumptions. I'm going to focus on the last assumptions here, that weight loss dieting is a form of healthy eating. It will make someone healthier by helping them lose weight. And that's what I'm going to focus on today. So I'm going to kind of put a pin in those other assumptions, but we can talk more about them later on if you're interested. Okay. So in response to the assumption that weight loss dieting is a form of healthy eating, it will make people healthier by helping them lose weight, some critics argue that weight loss dieting does not actually help people lose weight, that it instead may actually lead to weight gain and disordered eating behaviors, which are themselves unhealthy. So the pushback is actually weight loss dieting is unhealthy. It's not healthy. And again, just to note, this line of thinking does not critique healthism. So that's kind of staying in place here. we'll play on their terms for a bit. Now, a prominent source of support for these sorts of critiques is dietary restraint theory, and that's what I'm going to get into today. So to introduce very briefly dietary restraint theory to you all, first, what's dietary restraint? As I said, it's a technical term. And so I have two definitions here. The first from Schomburg, 2016, a cognitive effort exerted by an individual to eat less than they would like. Or another definition from Stuart Martin and Williamson, 2022, the cognitive effort to restrict food intake or the intent to control food intake. So if there are any philosophers of mind here, you're probably thinking, well, all those things are different. But we're going to sort of play fast and loose with all these distinctions about intentions and so on for now. So roughly we can say that dietary restraint, as it's used in the scientific literature, refers to when a person uses food rules to manage their eating, and this is contrasted with following physiological cues. So that's the dichotomy that they've set up. So instead of using hunger and satiety cues to tell you when to eat and how much, you use a food rule. That's what dietary restraint means. Now, dietary restraint theory, and I've abbreviated DRT, or restraint theory, sometimes called, asserts that dietary restraint for weight loss actually causes overeating and disordered eating behaviors. So that's the main claim. And here I have two quotes from review articles of the field. The first says, for decades, restraint theory has dominated the clinical literature on eating behavior and weight control. And that's from Johnson, Pratt, and Worrell, 2012. And then Lowe, 2022 says, restraint theory has helped launch a groundswell of anti-dieting sentiment in Western society. So dietary restraint theory has actually been a very useful tool for anti-dieting advocates. Perhaps you have not heard of it by name. I haven't until I started doing this research, but I have heard of intuitive eating. I'm guessing some of you have also heard of that. Here on my slide, I have pictures of the covers of the 3rd and 4th edition of Intuitive Eating by Evelyn Tribble and Elise Resch. They rely heavily on dietary restraint theory, and you can see a lot of the citations, in particular chapters of their book especially, are all dietary restraint theory. So this is one way that the theory has become popularized. It's sort of in the air in anti-dieting contexts. So dietary restraint theory, and I'll talk more about this as we go along, it really focuses on dietary restraint for weight loss purposes only. But some anti-dieting advocates seem to support a broad rejection of dietary restraint beyond weight loss dieting. So here I have two examples. Here's a quote from Lewis, 2023, who is a psychologist and academic, and this is an article from The Conversation. She says, many people with and without eating disorders have food rules around what they can and can't eat, when and how much, and this just sets us up to be obsessed with food. And then a second quote from Lewis, a person who has a healthy relationship with food listens to their body's needs. They don't have food rules around when they can and can't eat. And I've bolded that because I think that sets up that dichotomy between following physiological cues and following food rules quite nicely. Another example here is from intuitive eating itself. So one of the central tenets of intuitive eating is unconditional permission to eat. And the unconditional part is very important. And so that entails, and I'm quoting here from Tribble and Resch, the authors of Intuitive Eating, throwing out the preconceived notion that certain foods are good and others are bad, and, quote, eating what you really want, yes, what you want. And that's from the 2012 edition. And they explicitly say that at least temporarily, this means you have to give up food rules that are aimed at nutritional or ethical concerns. So they actually use the example of locavorism here. They say if you want to eat locally, that's an ethical concern, you have to give that up. And then also, and I think more controversially in that context, nutritional concerns. They have to give that up as well, at least when you're starting to learn how to eat intuitively. And so here's where I want to object. So I'm going to argue against this broad rejection of dietary restraint. I think that blanket dismissals of dietary restraint assume everybody can and should manage their eating in the same way, and that dietary restraint is quote unquote unhealthy in all cases. I think that assumption can be ableist, especially when different ways of managing eating are labeled as bad and discouraged. And part of my motivation here is that there are lots of different reasons why somebody might practice dietary restraint. Food, just a few examples: food allergies, intolerances, celiac, or other gut issues, to use Jane Drina's term. Someone who might be on an appetite-suppressing drug or have limited interoception regarding their hunger and satiety, maybe for neurodiversity reasons, may need to use dietary restraint. And then, of course, also people who practice ethical vegetarianism, veganism, religious diets, or if you have a specific health goal that you're eating to support. These, I think, are or at least can be very valuable ways of eating. And in some cases, they're life-saving. So I think we should try to preserve some sense of dietary restraint as a valuable thing. What I'm going to argue is that there's actually no direct evidence that using dietary restraint for these non-weight loss reasons is quote unquote unhealthy or bad in the ways that dietary restraint theory suggests. I'm also going to suggest that if we look at dietary restraint theory, which as far as I can tell is the main source of criticism for dietary restraint in general, it doesn't offer indirect evidence that this is quote unquote unhealthy or bad either. So the plan for today, I'm going to give a little overview of how dietary restraint theory works. Then I'm going to make my case that it provides no direct or indirect reason to think that dietary restraint for non-weight loss purposes is quote unquote unhealthy. And then I will argue that we should not disparage dietary restraint in general, not only because it's ableist, but it's just can be a useful tool for exercising eating agency, which I think is really important. Okay. So first up is, what is dietary restraint theory? So this theory was developed by C. Peter Herman and Janet Polivy, who both worked at the University of Toronto, and I believe one of them still works there, one's retired. And some different colleagues, mostly in the 1980s was when they started developing the theory, but they published as recently as 2 years ago a defense of their view and a review of the field. And the theory has two key parts. The first is the restraint scale, which is a questionnaire that identifies what they call chronic weight loss dieters for study. And then the restraint theory itself, which aims to explain the behavior of those dieters, specifically what they call the, quote, cycle of restriction and indulgence in overeating. So I'm going to focus on the theoretical part, but I do have a copy of the restraint scale I can show people later, and if you download my slides, it's an appendix on the slide. So how does this theory work? The first key part of the theory is the boundary model. So this is a theory about what starts and stops people from eating. So for them, quote unquote, normal eaters are motivated to eat by the feeling of hunger and motivated to stop eating by the feeling of satiety. So that's sort of the usual state of affairs if we didn't have diet culture. And in between these two boundaries of hunger and satiety, there is what they call a zone of indifference, where sometimes you might eat more if the food's tasty and the conversation's good. Sometimes you might eat less if the food doesn't taste good and you're in a rush, there's social pressures. So there is some wiggle room between these boundaries of how much you would eat, and that's where social factors come in, things like that. But basically the hard stops here are feelings of hunger and feeling of satiety. But for them, what happens when you're on a weight loss diet is the dieter will set a food intake or diet boundary to stop eating, and that's lower than their satiety boundary. So it's less food than you would need to eat to feel full. And the aim there, of course, is eating less and losing weight. And Herman and Polivy argue that this requires the dieter to ignore their hunger and satiety cues. So basically, whatever feelings you have of hunger and fullness, you're having to ignore them in order to stick to your diet boundary. And they suggest this dulls these cues or sort of interferes with the ability to perceive them accurately. And what that does, according to them, is it raises the satiety boundary. So it in effect, for somebody who has been dieting repeatedly, they're going to have a higher boundary for feeling full. They're going to need to eat more food to feel full than somebody who hasn't been on a diet repeatedly. So where the problem from their view comes in is that dieters regularly surpass their diet boundary. So are kind of regularly going over this low aim they have for how much to eat per day, whether because of emotional distress or just distraction. And then they say this triggers what they call the what the hell effect. And it's what the hell as in sort of like, what the hell? I've already broken my diet, so I might as well eat whatever else I want today. They actually call this, quote, a state of caloric abandon. And that's from a 1984 paper, where the dieter eats until their relatively high satiety boundary stops them. So that's where this problem of what they call overeating comes in. So from the perspective of this theory, they say, quote, the sorts of disinhibited eating that the dieter fears actually arise from dieting itself. And that's from a 1987 paper. And the remedy for them is to learn or relearn eating, quote, that occurs in response to hunger cues and stops in response to satiety cues. So that is dietary restraint theory itself. So does this theory give us any reason to think that using dietary restraint, using food rules, using a cognitive control of eating for other purposes is unhealthy in these ways? So does it cause overeating? Does it cause disordered eating behaviors? The short answer to this question is no, because the research explicitly is limited to people who are dieting for weight loss purposes. The questionnaire asks about, are you dieting for weight loss purposes? It asks about concern for weight loss. If you are not concerned with weight loss, you will not get a high score on the restraint scale, so you're not going to be subject to this, the studies. They're not interested in that. So there's no dietary restraint theory research that talks about this other use of dietary restraint. Also, I have found very little research outside of Herman and Polivy's sort of paradigm that looks at this question at all. If anybody has any, please send it to me, but I have not found any that directly addresses this question. So there's no direct evidence either way on this question. So the longer answer I have here is, well, can you use the theory? Can you reasonably sort of extrapolate or transfer this theory to non-weight loss context? Would it make sense to be worried about non-weight loss dietary restraint if we accept the theory? And here I'm going to argue no as well, except in very limited circumstances. And this is just because of how the mechanism works, according to them. So as I understand it, there are two key features of dietary restraint for weight loss, according to this theory. The first part, as I explained, the diet boundary leads to the dulling of hunger and satiety cues, raising the satiety boundary, so it takes more food to feel full. And then the second part is that diet boundary gets regularly violated, triggering the what the hell effect. So the dieter or the eater is regularly eating all the way to this relatively high boundary. Okay. But what I'm going to suggest is that many uses of dietary restraint or eating according to food rules just don't share those features. It doesn't make sense to think about other uses of dietary restraint in those ways. So I'm going to go through each one here and give some different examples. So with regard to the first part, the diet boundary leading to a dulling of hunger and satiety cues and raising that satiety boundary, Here I just have a little quote from a 1984 paper by Herman and Polvey, where they say, "It is the dieter's continuing attempt to live with the diet boundary, which in turn forces her to adopt a predominantly cognitive orientation to the question of when and how much to eat, that forces the hunger and satiety boundaries apart." Okay. But many food rules, or let me back up here. So there are some food rules for non-dieting purposes that could require ignoring hunger or satiety cues. So for example, someone who gets heartburn at night, maybe speaking from experience, you don't want to eat a few hours before bed because then you'll be in pain. So if you get hungry before bed, you might want to ignore that hunger. But that's very limited, right? You can still eat what you want during the day. You can make sure you have a larger supper so you don't get hungry. It doesn't require a sort of global or constant ignoring of hunger or satiety cues. But, there could be some other ones that require that. But many food rules don't regulate when and how much to eat. So just an example, a nut-free diet for allergy reasons, other health reasons, or a gluten-free diet, it's about what to eat, not when and how much. So it doesn't seem plausible to me that would impact your hunger or satiety perception at all, because it just doesn't have anything to do with that. Now, for the second part, which has to do with the regular violation of the diet boundary, I'm going to break this down into parts. So the first part, the diet boundary gets regularly violated. Well, the frequency of a violation seems to depend greatly on the content of the rule. So what are you trying to do with the rule and the context in which it's practiced? So, for example, if you follow a nut-free diet, so your food rules are don't eat nuts, don't eat things that are contaminated with nuts, and the consequences of that, violating that boundary, are extremely high. You'll become very ill. You will have to go to the hospital. It might even threaten your life. That seems to be a very different context, very different situation than trying to stick to a calorie-restricted diet where there's lots of tasty food around and social pressure to eat. It seems to me that in the first case, it's going to be much less likely that you're going to have frequent boundary violations just because of the consequences. Whereas in the second, it makes sense that there are frequent boundary violations. So I don't think that with at least some other food rules, it is likely that the boundary will be frequently violated. Also, the type of boundary may impact the frequency of violation. So here I'm drawing from a 1991 paper by Westenhofer, who writes about dietary restraint theory. And he introduces the distinction between rigid and flexible control over diet. And his idea is that if you have very rigid rules about what to eat and how much to eat, when to eat, that these are more likely to be violated than a more flexible rule. So for example, if you have a rigid rule, I can only eat X number of calories per day, never more. That's much more rigid than a more flexible dieting rule, like if I ate dessert yesterday, I won't have it today. That might be less likely to be violated. I don't think this maps perfectly onto the distinction between dieting and non-dieting. I think there are lots of dieting rules that are rigid, lots that can be flexible, and same with non-dieting rules. So food allergy or celiac food rules are definitely very rigid, but I think because of the consequences, that doesn't mean that they are likely to be frequently violated. Other non-dieting rules may be more flexible and thereby less likely to be violated. But in any case, I don't think that we can make a blanket statement that any food rule for any reason is going to be regularly violated. I think it really depends on the context and the content of the rule. But say, okay, we have some sort of food rule, it is regularly violated. The next step would be triggering the what the hell effect. But this effect seems premised on assumptions about what a boundary violation means. So here, and Herman and Polvey actually acknowledge this in a 1984 paper. So they say, the what the hell effect seems to presume that dieting is, quote, best considered in diurnal units. Once the daily diet quota has been surpassed, there's no point in further restraint, end quote. And they actually suggest there that if dieters ditch that assumption, it may, quote, diminish the incidence of the what the hell effect. So they themselves noted that there's this false belief in the mind, or like floating around in a lot of weight loss diet culture, that once you break, quote unquote, like break your diet for the day, you might as well eat whatever you want. That actually doesn't make sense for many food rules, including diet rules. But for things like celiac disease or allergies or something like that, that really doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense to have that sort of belief. And so if that's essential to triggering the what the hell effect, then I don't see any good reason to think that that's going to happen when we have non-dieting food rules. But say we did, then we have this last part. So the issue is we have a food rule that has been violated. It triggers the what the hell effect. Now the problem is, according to them, now the eater is going to eat all the way to this relatively high satiety boundary. She's going to overeat. But note here that they, even if a boundary violation did trigger this what the hell effect or state of caloric abandon, on their theory, the eater's just going to eat until she feels full. But there's no good reason to think that most food rules would raise the satiety boundary that I've suggested. So that if that's the case, then the person's just going to eat till they're full, which on their theory is just part of normal eating. That doesn't seem to be a problem. That doesn't seem to be a disordered eating behavior. So I don't think that there's a good cause for concern, even if we say, well, these food rules would be regularly triggered. They would cause the what the hell effect. So somebody's going to eat till they're full. I don't really see that as dangerous or quote unquote unhealthy. So I don't think there's a good reason to think that most non-weight loss dietary restraint would be unhealthy in the way that dietary restraint theory describes. Now, it's also worth noting briefly before I move on to the last section of the paper that dietary restraint theory has been subject to extensive critique in the literature. I can talk more about this in the Q&A if you're interested. One of the main critiques is that the restraint scale actually measures dietary restraint, so that cognitive control plus disinhibited eating together. They're not separated out, so you can't actually see the relationship between them. They're sort of connected in their scale rather than just restraint on its own. So for that reason, a few other tools have been developed to measure dietary restraint. And using those tools, they have found that some people can use dietary restraint for weight loss purposes without this quote unquote unhealthy result. So these alternative tools are called the 3-factor eating questionnaire, or TFEQ, and the Dutch eating behavior questionnaire, DEBQ. And they seem to capture dieters who succeed at maintaining their diet boundaries. Okay, but this is important. They don't thereby lose weight, right? So we still have this critique that I started with. Weight loss diets don't tend to actually help people lose weight. I'm happy to talk more about that later. It's very interesting, though. The scientific literature is very messy. But on to the last part. So I've suggested that dietary restraint theory provides no good reason to think that dietary restraint for non-weight loss purposes is quote unquote unhealthy. I think the theory implies that the impact of restraint depends, at least in part, on the content and aim of the food rules rather than the mere fact that one is using dietary restraint. It's not the fact that you use cognitive control compared to these physiological cues that causes the problem. It's what are the food rules that you're using, what's the context you're using them in. So we don't need to disparage dietary restraint in general in order to critique weight loss dieting or healthism or fatphobia about eating. I understand the impulse to sort of make these sweeping claims of stop using food rules, just eat intuitively. I see where people are coming from there, but I don't think we need to do that, and I don't think we should. That's not only because of the point I made earlier, where I think these blanket dismissals of dietary restraint assume everyone can and should manage their eating in the same way, that dietary restraint is unhealthy in all cases. I don't think that's true. And I think that can be ableist, especially when we're saying all these other ways of eating are unhealthy and bad. But I also think that dietary restraint it just can be a useful tool for exercising our eating agency. And by eating agency, I mean being able to eat in a way that we have authorship or ownership of, that we feel is in line with our life plans, our values, and that sort of thing. Now, exercising eating agency requires a great deal of structural, systemic, and relational support. But it can also require efficacious strategies for the individual management of eating. And dietary restraint can be such a strategy for some people, including people with food allergies, celiac, other gut issues, and ethical commitments, and so on. Effectively managing eating is very challenging, especially for people who are lacking structural, material, and interpersonal supports and resources. And I think we can critique dietary restraint for weight loss purposes. We can critique healthism and fatphobia about eating without dismissing what I think is a valuable and valid eating strategy that is dietary restraint. So I do have a slide with sources here. I won't read them out, but they are available on my website. And now here I just have a slide with a photo of a festive looking table set with food and dishes. And thank you. And you can contact me. My email address is deanmeg2@msu.edu if you would like to talk further. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Megan. That was great. Fantastic paper. So we do have about just shy of 15 minutes for Q&A. So panelists, put your questions in the chat, but everybody else, please put your questions in the Q&A, which is at the bottom of, you can find it at the bottom. And I guess am I to read the questions? Yes. Okay. So the first, people liked your talk. So the first question is, am I supposed to say who it's from? First name, August. And it says, hi, Megan, thanks for the fantastic talk. I want to give you a disability-related case of dietary restraint from my lived experience and see what you may think about it. So I have extreme misophonia, which manifests in part as extreme fight or flight aversion to the sounds of other people chewing. One thing that helps is so-called mimicking. When I am eating at the same time, it becomes a little bit easier to be around someone else eating. When I eat at a restaurant with someone who doesn't know that I have misophonia, who I don't want to disclose it to, I need to practice dietary restraint with regards to the kinds and amounts of food that I order and the speed at which I eat it, so it aligns with my meal companion's orders, and I'm able to use mimicking throughout the meal. I have to quite intentionally throw hunger and satiety cues out the window. I agree this is not unhealthy for me to do, but I'm not sure whether I think it's related to an increased sense of eating agency for me. What do you think?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for sharing that example. So I think that eating agency, so let me say this about eating agency. A lot of times in the literature about food ethics, people talk about eating like autonomy in a very narrow way. Everybody here is familiar with this, like very narrow sense of autonomy that people tend to use in mainstream philosophy. And there it sort of gets limited to, did you get to eat the food that you wanted in a particular moment, yes or no? If you did, then you got to exercise your autonomy. Right? But I think of food agency or eating agency in a much broader sense as being extended through time and having to do with not just what did you eat, but where did you eat, who did you eat with, did you get to eat in a way or with people or in a context that is part of a life that you find valuable. And so for me, the fact that you're able to eat with somebody that presumably you want to eat with, that it's valuable for you to share a meal with this person, whether it's a colleague or a new friend that you're meeting, or somebody like that, somebody, because you're saying you don't, this is with people you don't know very well. Maybe it's a new person that you're trying to get to know, that's valuable to you. And so being able to share a meal with somebody so you can get to know them, that actually is exercising your eating agency. And so it sounds like you found a strategy to be able to do that actually does enhance your eating agency, even if it means that you're not eating the foods that maybe you would choose to eat otherwise, or in a way that if you were by yourself or with somebody that you knew well, you would choose to eat. But because I have this kind of expanded understanding of what food or eating agency means, I think this is actually a great example of you exercising your eating agency, because it's a way of eating that is valuable to you, even if the details of what and how you're eating are not what you would otherwise choose. So thank you so much for that example. That's great.
Thank you. Okay, the next question is from Cecilia, and it says, thank you, Megan, for your talk defending to a certain extent practice of restraining one's diet non-weight loss for non-weight loss purposes. I notice that your arguments don't address the problem of corporate food producers actively altering or creating foods to make them more addictive. I was wondering if you considered arguments against intuitive eating and DRT theory, which address how they can work toward bypassing people's efforts to resist addictive corporate food production tactics, which also often work toward reinforcing marginalization for the purposes of profit.
Thank you, Cecilia. I'm not 100% sure if I understand exactly the question. So I'll say some things and you can let me know if it's hitting the mark. So in my work, I say that I work on ethics of eating instead of food ethics, usually, because I'm more interested in the practice of eating and the ways that is ethically important, whereas a lot of other people work on food ethics, where they're thinking about, well, how's the food produced, how's the food distributed, what is in the food, which I think are very important questions as well, but that's just not the angle that I'm approaching the questions from. So these sort of concerns about, I'm thinking you're probably thinking of ultra processed foods, but a specific subset of ultra processed foods, because that also includes things like tofu and that are quote unquote addictive. And sort of the way that people talk about them in the literature is that they bypass your cognitive controls of eating and sort of tap into these physiological needs or desires that we have, and that means you eat more than you would otherwise if you were kind of controlling your eating rationally, or you would eat things that you wouldn't choose to eat because they're like speaking to your body in some way. I just think that the metaphysics of all that is very complicated and messed up. And I feel uncomfortable with calling foods addictive. I think that metaphor needs to be explored and critiqued. It's possible that on some definitions of addiction that does work. I definitely think that there's evidence that some foods are made to be extremely palatable to people, and then kind of in some cases they would eat them. It would impact their eating behaviors in ways that if the food didn't have those qualities, it wouldn't. But I guess there's just a lot of premises in this sort of conversation about foods that I'm not comfortable with, so that I would want to explore and critique. And so I guess that's what I'll say. I don't think that probably doesn't satisfy your question, but I would need to kind of get into all of those things a bit more in order to answer that question. So that's okay.
Thank you. Kristin has a question.
Hi, Megan. Thanks for letting me ask my question verbally, because I find it really hard to type smart things when I'm trying to listen to smart things. And anyway, I really enjoyed this. I think it's really precise, the way you're taking out in these individual premises. What are their assumptions? One piece I wanted to ask you more about was the connection to intuitive eating, because it seems like DRT is kind of considered to be sort of solved by this return to intuitive eating. And this is one of the things that is discussed a lot in sort of fat activist communities, about how we're told if you just intuitively eat, your body will go to its natural set point. But there's this idea somehow that there's this natural pre-formed desire in your body that you can tune into. And so I guess I want you to say a little more about, are those two things kind of like counter structures to each other, or can they operate independently of each other? So basically, is intuitive eating the necessary response to, or is there another way? Because I do want you, like you say, to be able to hang on to non-weight loss food rules. Because, I mean, one of the critiques is that intuitive eating is actually just another form of weight loss dieting. And so then if that doesn't work out, then you're really in trouble. And then the next question I had was whether DRT has as an assumption caloric restriction, and that the caloric restriction, not the ruleness, is what causes the rebound, so that there's something in us trying to get back what we weren't able to have. So anyway, if you could just on those things, I'd love to hear more about your paper. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. I'll answer the second one first. So so the whole model of dieting, that the boundary model that they use, it really it assumes the caloric balance model of weight. So more calories, don't burn them off, gain more weight, or weigh more, less calories, burn more off. Yeah, it totally assumes that. They acknowledge that, and in some of their work, they'll say things like, Herman and Polivy will say, well, this is how everyone thought about dieting in the 80s, and that's when we came up with our theory. So, of course, that's in the theory. And of course, that's in the theory. But it's still, it's a very flat model of weight in general. So, yes, they totally assume that. And I think an alternative way of thinking about the problem of this rebound or this disinhibited eating is thinking about it in terms of, okay, caloric restriction. When you don't eat enough calories for whatever your body to function, then you will eat more. But if the rule is about don't eat nuts, then your body's not like, oh no, I'm not getting enough nuts for my brain to work. So we need to eat all the nuts. Like it's just totally a different context. I think that's a very plausible reading of it, and that the way that they and a lot of people in the literature think about dieting is just caloric restriction. And so and I mean, dieting means so many other things, and we know that weight is actually very complex, and it's not just about calories in and calories out, even though that's the has been the received view for so long. So yeah, I think that's part of it. It's very hard for me as a philosopher.
We have 2 minutes for your answer.
Okay, great. Well, then I'll jump to the second question. But yeah, so Herman and Polivy actually wrote their own diet book in the 80s. It only had one printing, so I don't think it did very well. But they did. There's this paperback. I try to get a copy through my library. But so they did try to put forward their own diet solution to this, and they do say, we need to kind of abandon this pursuit of weight loss. but I kind of agree with you. There's this sort of bait and switch thing, at least in how people think about intuitive eating, or the sort of physiologically guided way of eating, where they think, well, that's actually going to help me lose weight. I just can't think about it as a way of losing weight. It's like you have to trick your mind somehow. I'm not really trying to lose weight. And that's the trick to actually losing weight. I don't, yeah, I think that there are lots of anti-dieting dietitians, intuitive eating dietitians, who do a great job of actually like challenging that and thinking about it in a not fatphobic way. But I do think in practice that happens. Intuitive eating is very specific. It has a lot of specific rules and methods. I don't think that the DRT folks are saying that is exactly the way, but it matches up. It's this assumption that if you eat according to physiology, that's the key. Then the question's, how do you do that? And intuitive eating offers a path, a method for doing that. But I think there could be other ones too. So,
Thank you.
Yeah.
That's great. That was excellent. There's some feedback more in the chat. I put a question in the chat for you, and there's another question for you in the Q&A that you could have a look at if you feel like typing an answer. Megan, you're welcome to do so. That's from Sahana. And so now we're going to go on to Lori Gruen's paper on eating disabled animals. Thanks, Megan.
Thanks, Tracy.
Thanks, Lori.
I'm Lori Gruen, and I'm an older white presenting woman with long gray hair and purple glasses. I hope you can see the purple, maybe you can't. But I'm sitting in front of beige window coverings, and behind me is a photo and some clutter. I just want to say I seem to have woken up this morning with some congestion, so I hope that I don't break out into some sort of inability to speak clearly. I really wanted to thank Jonathan and Shelley as well for their organizing and of this fifth conference. It's such an important conference. And I have to say that I have learned so much from the past conferences. And so I'm excited to be here and presenting. The presentation that I'm going to do today is part of an ongoing project that I've been working on, exploring the troubled relationship between animal ethics and disability studies. This project is really also, sorry, Shelley, I don't mean to embarrass you, but really inspired a lot by conversations with Shelley. She's been such an inspiration to me. So I just want to note that. But before I get to the topic of eating and food politics, I want to share a little, just a very few thoughts to situate my perspective on the tension between animal ethics and disability studies, because this caveat is really important, I found, in talking about these issues, just because there's so much, the tension is very visceral and people really do feel it, as do I. I'm really disappointed and indeed really quite angry, and that anger is growing about the ableism that's both overt in animal ethics, but also implicit in a lot of animal activist spaces. And of course, Peter Singer's prominence within animal ethics and animal activism, and his ableist language and attitudes and writing contribute to this tension. And I think it's in part that his positionality as a leader in animal ethics is what kind of allows people to not think critically about some of the assumptions and views and attitudes that he presents. For example, and I know many of you already know this, but I just want to sort of be critical about it again. He often refers to what he calls quote unquote normal humans. And his assumption is that if anybody were given a chance, they would prefer to be quote unquote normal, by which he means normate, right? He means classically liberal, independent, rational, moved by reason and evidence, as it were, straight, white, able-bodied, fit, and cisgendered. And this idealization of normalcy, again, part of what Shelley calls the apparatus of disability, just basically is a way of excluding and disciplining some who don't quite fit the picture that is identified as what elevates certain individuals, quote unquote, normal individuals like him. And he uses the status of his quote unquote normalcy in much of the discussion of animal ethics. And he also does it by tying these quote unquote normal views to things like effective altruism and other sort of deeply problematic and questionable consequentialist commitments. And it also, I think, and this is part of where my anger is growing, it allows him to dismiss philosophers of disability by saying he doesn't really understand what we're talking about, or saying that he doesn't really need to meet or doesn't even know any disabled people, which is just sort of mind-boggling. And it also contributes to his distorted picture of what normal animals are like. So one of the things he says, and this is quote unquote normal animals, is that, he talks a lot about chimpanzees having the intelligence that's comparable to 3-year-old children. And he thinks that this is something that has some meaningful content. And it really is a very peculiar and challenging thing to say. I always ask, which chimpanzee and which 3-year-old child are you speaking about? And he just tends to think that normalcy tracks in this comparative way. And I think that's a really big problem. He also fails to acknowledge or even discuss disabled animals. So this is a huge problem that arises. I'm sure Tracy's also had this experience where there tends to be this view, because he's so prominent, that if you talk about animal ethics or eating animals, you're already in an ableist kind of context. And my project now is to try to show that although it's difficult, and I'm going to talk about how it's difficult, it is a distortion. I don't think that his views and his ableist views are views that we have to sort of paint the whole project of animal ethics with. And my work of late is to try to intervene in that picture, although I've been doing that intervention for decades, but this is the specific current intervention. And of course, not all people who work in animal ethics or who work for animal liberation are ableist at all. And Sonora Taylor's work is a powerful example that directly confronts the impact of ableism on our thinking about animals and vice versa in her book, Beast of Burden. And I'll be drawing on some of that work in this presentation today. But overcoming ableism and thinking about animals is not uncomplicated. And there's a worry that I have, and I want to push against, that we could kind of simply say, okay, we're not going to be ableist about our animal ethics. And I think this is it's a lot more difficult than that. There are significant confusions that often emerge when thinking about disabled animals in many contexts, particularly animals in the so-called wild. So consider the fox, who Sunny Taylor discusses at the beginning of her powerful chapter Animal Crypts. This is a chapter in the book Beasts of Burden, but it's also reprinted in a 2020 collection called Disability and Animality, Crypt Perspectives in Critical Animal Studies, that was edited by Stephanie Jenkins and Kelly Struthers-Montfort and Chloe Taylor. And so Sunny Taylor, so it's funny, there's Chloe Taylor and Sunny Taylor, so I'll try to make sure I'm not confusing. Sunny Taylor writes, a few years ago, I found a story about a fox with arthrogryposis, which is the debility that she was born with. The fox was shot by a hunter because, quote, it had an abnormal gait and appeared sick, end quote. The animal, whose disabilities were quite significant, had normal muscle mass And his stomach contained a large amount of digested food, which suggested that the limb deformity did not preclude successful hunting and foraging. That's in quotes. And then Sonny goes on to say that the shooting was presented as a mercy killing. A hunter would have shot a normal fox too, of course, but for less purportedly altruistic reasons. However, this fox actually seemed to be doing very well. She goes on to talk about the ways that our human ableist attitudes and practices are projected onto animals and leads us to thinking about disabled animals with pity, often forcing us to embrace the idea that they are, quote unquote, better off dead. When thinking about disability and wild animals, we're challenged to explore the impact of the social model of disability or the apparatus of disability, other than the ways in which it colonizes our own thinking that then leads to our projection. Because some wild animals are born with certain conditions that prove disabling, even if they never encounter humans and are ableist prejudices and practices. And this raises, I think, at least theoretical issues about how to understand their situations and what might be considered, quote unquote, natural, as well as the social model of disability. But this isn't what I want to focus on today. This is just an example of how these issues become really complicated when bringing them together. It's not like simply, okay, we need to get over our ableism and then we have a good animal ethics. There's more complicated issues, I think, going on. But because this is a session on food and eating, I want to focus on eating disabled animals on factory farms. And again, I'm going to cite Sonny, because here the social model of disability is more obvious. And I think importantly, when we're talking about animals in the food system, we're talking about a very particular kind of situatedness that's quite distinct from maybe other contexts. So I want us to be thinking about these things in very sort of contextual ways. This is another fairly lengthy quote from Sonny Taylor. It seems impossible, she writes, to consider the disability that farmed animals experience as separate from their environments. The mother pig is made utterly immobile, not by physical difference or disease, but by the metal bars of her gestation crate. The hens suffer from pain, but whether that pain is due to a broken leg, overcrowding, complete darkness, or the death of her cage mate is impossible to know. The dairy cow is euthanized not because she cannot walk, but because she has become a symbol of contamination. Such animal environments clearly disable them even more than their physical and psychological disabilities do, a fact that supports the social model of disability. Trying to pinpoint disability and disease in these environments is no less challenging than trying to ascertain what does and does not qualify as disability among human beings. What does it even mean to speak of a healthy and normal chicken, pig, or cow when they all live in environments that are profoundly disabling? Indeed, and this is, I think, really critical, when they are all bred to be disabled. The conditions of life, so that's Sonny, but now this is back to me. The conditions of life and death for the approximately 9 billion broiler chickens who are created, raised, and ultimately slaughtered every year just in the United States is a prime example of what we might call captive disability. These birds are genetically engineered to quickly grow extremely large breasts. Their small legs often can't hold them up. They're terribly unbalanced, and many chickens fall over onto substrate that's soaked with burning ammonia from their waste. Their hearts and lungs often fail due to their disabled bodies and their extreme living conditions and the rapidness with which they grow. Hundreds of thousands of young birds spend their shortened lives in windowless warehouses, packed wing to wing, and those that suffer heart attacks or can't get up due to the weight of their bodies are often trampled by other birds. Their bodily disfigurations, their suffering, and their early deaths are impacted by both human supremacism and ableism. I wanted to show a very short clip. It's a little less than, it's a little over 3 minutes long. It's not easy to watch because it's the inside of a chicken factory. And it was from the New York Times op doc that Leah Garces, who's the head of Mercy for Animals, was able to get done. So let's cross fingers or wishful thinking here that I'm going to be able to share this in a way that works. It worked earlier, so let me see. I hope everybody can see it. Yes? I'm going to try to play this part.
What I'm about to show you is very rare. It's almost impossible to get inside one of these buildings.
Where are we?
On a farm raising chickens for Pilgrim's Pride, one of the biggest poultry producers in the country.
But
When I enter one of these houses, it's like you're entering a nuclear waste site.
This is Leah Garces. She's on a mission to end factory farming. She's going to take us inside.
And it's gonna smell really bad. I am not prepared for the smell, for this wall of ammonia that hits you. And it stings your eyes, you start coughing. It is a sea of white.
No natural light, no fresh air, right? It's the most barren environment possible.
All of these birds, tens of thousands of birds, are defecating. And the ammonia produces burns on their chest and on the pad of their feet.
That's a burn from the ammonia on his foot. And, you know, red, raw, dead sore looking belly from laying on the litter like that all the time. It's very hot to touch.
You'd only go a few steps before you'd see a bird with the leg splayed out to one side or back deformed. And they have very labored breath, and you can see their eyes are glassy.
There's a really bad one up here. I don't even want to.
If you eat cheap chicken in America today, this is almost certainly how it lives.
These are the birds that are going to supermarket, to restaurant chains, to wherever you're eating chicken. If you've eaten one of these chickens, you've eaten an animal that had burns somewhere on their body.
These conditions are the byproduct of a system designed to maximize profits and satisfy your appetite for cheap chicken. Notice the dim light? It's carefully regulated. More light makes the birds excited and burn more calories. Alongside decades of selective breeding, this means they now grow 6 times faster than a century ago, with lots of juicy breast meat. But look at this. Their small bodies struggle to support the extra weight.
Something's wrong with her legs and they can't find her balance.
A typical thing you will see is a flipped over bird. So they're on their back, wings up, and they've had a heart attack because their heart has been exhausted by this growth.
Yeah, chickens die before they even make it to the slaughterhouse. A lot of them. About 4,000 on this one farm alone in a 6-week period, from dehydration, heart attacks, and disease. That's a mortality rate of about 5%. And you know, that's the average across the whole country. Add up every factory farm in the US, and you have around 450 million chickens dying every year.
Okay. Sorry about that. I think it is a rare bit of footage, so I wanted to share. Globally, an estimated 72 billion land and 1 to 3 trillion aquatic animals are killed for consumption each year. Worldwide consumption of animals has increased more than 5-fold since 1950, and factory farms, or what government agencies in the industry are now referring to as CAFOs, concentrated animal feeding operations, are being set up in many countries other than the US, particularly those that have relatively lax regulation and enforcement of welfare standards. Humans, too, are exposed to disabling conditions in the production of disabled animals for food, as factory farms damage the quality of life in the communities in which they're located. There are regular stories of the ways that the waste from large pig factory farms, for example, destroy communities. After Hurricane Florence, it hit North Carolina in 2018. Over 3 million chickens and thousands of pigs died. But residents were worried about the flooding of the manure lagoons outside of the pig farms. North Carolina is home to around 10 million pigs, and the waste they produce is stored in these lagoons. 33 lagoons overflowed from the storm, discharging tons of hog feces into the surrounding area. And it's not just natural disasters, really, that lead to this problem, but day-to-day exposure to the shit that's debilitating. I wanted to now also show you a very quick trailer from a new film about the impact of hog farming in North Carolina, which is called The Smell of Money. It's a short trailer.
They are poisoning our soil, poisoning our groundwater, poisoning people, fellow Americans. They are stealing from them in the present and stealing from future generations.
If it does not touch you in an emotional way, if you really get in to look at this issue, whether it's from an environmental standpoint of an animal rights issue, whether it's a human rights issue, whether it's an antibiotic use issue, if you can walk away from this saying, no big deal, you need to come talk to me, let me take you for 3 days and let you sit down and talk to these people who have to live with this every day. Matter of fact, let me let you live in their shoes for a day and see if it doesn't change your mind.
No, and ain't nobody helping us do nothing. They don't care because we're black. We're back up in the country. I just hope my house don't get burned up tonight from talking to you. Because I'm sure he's somewhere peeping now. You can believe that. He got his boys on you. What make you think you have a right to set up a hog farm and destroy my way of life? People don't have access to clean air and clean water anymore.
One of the most disturbing stories that I've heard is the sensation of being sprayed with shit, basically.
I have seen this stream filled with feces and urine from this hog operation right up here more than one time.
Almost every fish in the river died. Over 1 billion fish died in a period of about a week and a half.
Every one of us on this road got help. Say, every one of us. Trust me.
Our health is at stake here. To raise animals in this way puts all of us at risk.
It is time that the village stand up, step up, and speak up.
If these people had lived in the mansions, it would have been a different story.
It's the power to control. That's what drives man to the end of sanity.
All the laws protect these industries. No one is protecting us.
The people in communities around factory farms or CAFUs are disabled by the conditions they are forced to live under. People in poor communities of color are unable to move away from these places, leading to increased vulnerability to disablement and premature deaths. So, what should we do about this? Is going vegan the right, or is it the ethical response? And I want to suggest that the answer to the question what to do is complicated. And in this sort of last section, I'm truncating this discussion, but in this last section, I want to briefly identify some issues that have to be addressed in order to answer the question that yes, veganism is an important way to address this issue. But let me start with an observation that regularly has been startling me, at least regularly over the last, say, 6 or 7 years. So I've been teaching Sunny Taylor's book since it first came out in 2017. And for many students and for people more generally, particularly many feminists, and as Megan was just talking about, certain people who are thinking about dietary restraint, the idea that there should be another restriction on eating in cultures like ours, in which ableism and beauty norms and the glorification of slimness and anti-fatness and fat phobia and eating disorders have particularly significantly negative impacts on people who identify as women, particularly those who are young or disabled, claim that what one should eat, claiming that what one should eat or having any kind of dietary restraint should be viewed with suspicion at best. But learning the fact that the animals that are eaten are created to be disabled, in addition, surprisingly, that these animals are killed as children, has led my students, as particularly in a course I teach called Humans, Animals, Nature, to be much more sympathetic than they were before we started talking about disability. And I was like, huh, this is interesting. I've been teaching courses like this for well over 20 years. And it just so happened that as I started teaching more about disability in my Humans, Animals, and Nature class, the students somehow were more prone towards sympathy towards the animals in their plight. And this has struck me as really startling. And these are generally students who, like many people, don't want to think about what they should and shouldn't eat. They generally tend to get fairly defensive about this. They're not students that are already vegetarians or vegans. I mean, of course, there's always a couple that are vegetarian, vegan, but they're in the minority. And that they're so sympathetic really has got me worried, because it seems clearly to be a version of the pitying response that is so much a feature of ableism. So if the motivation for not eating animals because they're disabled is a thinly veiled form of ableism, then it seems like a bad idea to think about veganism as an answer to the problem of disabled, disabled, and of a problem answer to the problem of the practice of disabling animals in CAFOs or factory farms. But of course, we don't need to accept the ableism that's a part of it. We just need to become aware of it. And in an essay in the Disability and Animality book that I mentioned, Chloe Taylor and Kelly Montfort Struthers, those two of the editors of that volume suggest that we can still understand and critique the disabling animal agricultural business without also falling into the ableist response that I fear my students have fallen into. Here's what they write. While remaining critical of the many ways that animal agriculture materially harms the minds, bodies, we can reject ableism while remaining critical of the many ways that animal agriculture materially harms the mind bodies of animals, including the human animals that I was showing you. While the insight of critical disability studies certainly caution us against denigrating or devaluing the lives of the more than human animals and human workers and eaters who have been disabled by animal agriculture, ultimately, this is Chloe Taylor and Kelly, do not think that a disability politics requires that we accept or take a neutral stance on capitalist industries that sacrifice the well-being of animals and workers and consumer safety in the interest of profit. There are other motivations for turning towards veganism, I would argue, beyond ableist sympathy for animals bred in disabling animal industries. Avoiding animal products may be something that brings meaning to someone's life. They may feel that they don't want to participate in a violent system, one that's created precisely to cause pain, disrespect, debilitation, and death, so that some others can profit. It may feel akin to conscientious objection, but this doesn't obviously or ever really impact the structures that support this violent industry. Like no one has ended a war by refusing to participate or refusing to go. So if people are in a position to resist the use of others for food, that is good for them, and it may inspire others to follow along. Recognizing one's complicity in a system of violence and deciding to stand against it by refusing, as far as possible, to participate in or directly benefit from that system can have significant effects on others. Many who work towards veganism influence others to do so, and they in turn can influence others, who in turn may influence others, and so on. Thus, going vegan may increase the probability that others will become vegan, which increases the probability that the collective action of the aggregate more quickly brings about an end to the using animals for food and bringing about a decrease in violence, exploitation, and domination. And many disabled vegans are motivated in this way. But some would-be vegans, and this is another part of the complexity, aren't in positions to choose what they eat. It's eye-opening and admirable for those who are unable to control their food choices. So people who are in prisons, for example, or people who are in care facilities who have to have their food, who really have no control over what food is produced and what they have to eat. And this is, I think, a really important area that's been more underexplored. But they may eat animals and animal products because they don't have any options not to. But at the same time, and this is what I think is so important, can protest the cruel and corrupt corporate system that maims and kills the animals. So Sunny Taylor, of course, raises this in her book. As a disabled vegan, she highlights that for many disabled people who rely on others to provide them with food in care settings, it's difficult to get access to plant-based food, but they nonetheless can protest. And so here I think it's really important. I know I'm running close to time, but here I'm thinking it's really important to be thinking about, one doesn't have to be to actually eat in a way that we might think of as vegan, to nonetheless be actively protesting the system that I just showed you clips to describe. So the response to those systems, again, is not an individualized response. It's a systemic response. And so we need to come together to collectively work to resist the limitation of the various options that people who are in care or in captive settings of various sorts experience. So we do need to work on food justice concerns within prisons, and there are really interesting projects trying to do that. And the same thing would be true in care facilities or even in schools and hospitals. So it's not simply that you're only connected. Right. Okay. So, okay, I'm going to end. Sorry. I thank you, Tracy. So anyway, I think that it's really important that a call for a complex anti-oppression, anti-ableist, multi-species politics of eating is the right thing to be doing. But I'm hoping that more of us can think harder about developing arguments and spurring motivations that can lead us to resisting eating animals. Thanks. Sorry, I went over, Tracy.
That's all quite all right. Thank you. Thank you, Lori. Great talk. So again, we have about, let's see, we have about 12 minutes for Q&A, and please put your questions in the Q&A thing. And if you're a panelist, you can either raise your hand to be called upon or put your question in the chat. And so far we have no questions.
Oh, everybody's vegan, yeah.
Oh, everything was perfectly, oh, here's a question. Okay, this is from Cecilia. Thank you for your talk, Lori, about the relationship between ableism, disability, and especially animal disability. I think you presented a really thought-provoking argument about how factory farming produces disabling conditions for animals. Now, they can also be disabling for human beings as well. I also appreciate how your argument touches on the complexity of how not eating disabled animals can also be ableist. To that extent, I think your argument is intriguingly complex and enlightening in thinking about the connections between ableism and factory farming. I'm left, however, wondering whether your argument can be used to promote humane animal farming rather than to promoting veganism.
Oh, yeah, that's an excellent question. I think it largely is going to depend on what one thinks about humane farming. I don't think there is such a thing myself. And part of the reason I don't think there is such a thing is that this is a whole nother set of arguments that I've made in different places, so I won't get too deep into them. But I think that animals are beings that have their own lives and relationships, and unless we're in conditions in which we really have no options, and I think there are obviously contexts in which people don't have options, that we should avoid ending the lives of others to eat them unless it's a necessity. And so I think that that's it. What I aspire to and what I argue for is what I call contextual moral veganism. And contextual moral veganism is the idea that other animals have, I put it this way often, that it's a category mistake to think of them in the category of edible, and that there's only certain kind of contexts in which it makes sense to actually eat animals, and in those contexts it's also not the case that the animals are thought to be edible. You can eat them, but they're not in the category of edible, and so this is something that I think is a really important distinction, and it's also argued in a variety of ways. I often think that somebody can do something that is considered, quote unquote, a crime, but needn't be considered a, quote unquote, criminal, because that is another way of importing a whole set of values, normate values really, on others. It's another way of othering individual people who might do something wrong at some point in time, commit a crime at some point in time, doesn't sort of make their whole existence criminal. Similarly, I think there are contexts in which animals might be eaten. I think in certain kinds of places in Canada, northern Canada in particular, where it's not really possible or environmentally or ecologically sensible to be importing tofu, which is what also, Megan, I don't know if tofu counts as hyper processed or if it's just processed, but anyway, that's a question I wanted to ask. We didn't have time. So the idea here is I don't think that animals are in general the kinds of beings that we in most parts of the country should and the world should be eating, whether they're raised, quote unquote, humanely, whatever that means. Sorry, I went on too long.
Thank you. Jonathan.
Thank you very much. Fascinating talk. And I mentioned to you before on the panel, as a teenager, I worked on a chicken farm. It was an egg farm, battery eggs. And in fact, the conditions were worse than the ones that you presented, because the chickens were in cages and so didn't even have the free access to air. And that was 50 years ago, and I think it's probably still going on just as badly. But I just wanted to go back to the very beginning, where you were very helpfully explaining your difference from Peter Singer, and I think that is important. But I wondered if the issue is sort of broader than Peter Singer. I've been at a couple of conferences that Eva Kitte set up, where she did a type of set piece debate, once with Singer and once with Jeff McMahon. And she wanted really to drive a wedge between philosophers of disability and philosophers of animal equality. And I feel this pang myself as well, having not to any depth written about both topics. and on the one hand being quite sympathetic to the idea that there is a problem of speciesism, where if human beings are seeing themselves as different to animals. But at the same time, in thinking about disability, people want to emphasize common humanity. And so from the point of view of drawing everyone into the human species, disability theorists often want to draw some circle around all human beings, whereas people who believe in animal equality want to break that circle down. So I wondered if you feel this attention in your own work, whether it's overstated, whether there's a way through that. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Jonathan. That must have been hard working in a terrible battery factory. I've written about this and talked a little bit about this in other places, and I think that's partly what I was highlighting, this important tension. I do think that there is a kind of human supremacism that operates in some, but certainly not all, philosophers of disability. And there is a kind of ableism, or in the case that I'm talking about with Jeff McMahon and Peter Singer, very visceral ableism in their work. And I think part of what's happening is there's a group of us that are trying to sort of exactly break those things down. And one of the things that, say, Ava talks about that I really like and think is right is a more relational understanding of our experiences and the ethical demands of relationships in, let's say, our family, when there are people who have various disabilities in the family, and that can be the source of an understanding of how it might be that we should, as you put it, expand the circle to include all humans and all humanity. But one of the things that I've often said in response to that is families aren't made up just of humans, whether they're able-bodied or disabled humans. They're also made up of animals. And I feel like there's this kind of heteronormative frame that gets imported in those kinds of and human supremacist or human exceptionalist frame that gets imported in those kinds of ideas. And I think that is something to be thinking about. We organize our family lives and we organize our personal lives, and in those experiences of our families and our personal experiences, we draw on those experiences to sort of make our way and make moral sort of judgments and agencies. And I think importantly, in these very personal cases of Eva Kate and Peter Singer, we have so Peter Singer has never lived with animals. He's never considered animals part of his family. He doesn't even like animals very much, is what he says regularly. That's just too sentimental. Eva has, but she still has the view that her dog is not as important as the humans in the family. And I want to challenge both of those ideas, and I have in my writing.
Thank you. We have time for a really quick question from Shelley, if it's quick.
This isn't a question as much as a comment. I just wanted to say that, to point out to Jonathan that the division between disability theorists and theorists like Eva Kate and others who think that we have to keep keep these claims about animals and humans very separate has really shifted. I think especially since the publication of Sonora Taylor's book, Beasts of Burden. So disability theorists and researchers have really sort of come more on board with arguments about against speciesism and the sort of arguments that Sonny Taylor has put forth, and also like Stephanie Jenkins and others. So I think that has really shifted. I don't think that there. I think the concern for animals and the move to bring animals into the community of disabled people has really shifted since all that work has been done. And I think that the conference that you were probably referring to was before that work. So yeah, that's all I wanted to say.
And can I just say one other thing, Tracy, before we end? I've been really encouraging. Actually, I gave a talk at the conference before last about this, and I haven't published it. It's part of this bigger project that I was mentioning. But I do think we should move away from the term speciesism, in part because I think the very concept of species is itself ableist, and so I think it makes that you might have. I was saying human exceptionalism and human supremacism. I just want to highlight, I think that we need to sort of think carefully about invoking the notion of species. And Shelley and I, we've talked about that too. Thanks very much, everybody.
So interesting. I want to hear more about that, but not right now. So, Lori, there are a couple of lingering questions for you in the Q&A if you wanted to have a look at them. And I think there's an option there if you wanted to type your answer or put it in the chat. And now we are going to hear from Kristin Rodier on the topic fatness and the abnormal disciplining bodies in the age of Ozempic.
Hi. Speaking of animals, I have an unruly adolescent dog in this room with me right now. It's crying. So I hope that, can everyone hear me? Okay, I put a link to my paper in the chat. So if people want to follow along, 1 second. There's only so many animals I could get rid of from the house this morning to make it quiet. Okay, so I'm Kristin Rodier. My pronouns are she, her. I'm a professor of philosophy at Athabasca University. I'm a fat white woman. Behind me, I have some books and knickknacks, notions, pictures. It's a bit cluttered. I've got dark hair, about shoulder length, and red glasses, and a black top. I look a little tired. It's early in the morning here. Speaking of which, I'm beaming to you from a place called Pehonan, which is located on Treaty 6 territory, specifically Amisqua, Wahiskikan, the lands of the Plains Cree, Woodland Cree, the Beaver Cree, the Ojibwe, and the homeland of the Métis people of Alberta, also known as Beaver Hills House. So it's become part of my conference practice to acknowledge at the outset those who help to support and clarify my ideas in ways that are not citationally legible. I do this to resist the author as individual and to make clear the relational networks that make my intellectual labor possible. Many of the ideas here work their way through my network of co-conspirators. So for their radical support, I just want to name some of my people: Cindy Baker, Catherine Clune-Taylor, Megan Dean, Emily Douglas, Anna Muda, and Cressida Hayes. I also want to thank Shelley and the conference organizers for inviting me to share my work. It has become a highlight of my year. Other people are saying this, so that's part of the groundswell here. It's been a highlight of my year to learn what everyone has been working on. And in keeping with Shelley's advocacy in the discipline of philosophy, inviting my work on fat specifically helps to elevate my claim that fat is philosophically interesting. I've had a lot of coffee. I locate my work within critical disability studies, not just because of how my fat disabled body is taken up socially, medically, and interpersonally, but because of how I understand fat and disability theoretically, which is not merely analogically or intersectionally, but as part of a larger apparatus of the production of abnormality through pathologization, social exclusions, and violence. For me, it's important to describe fat oppression while always clarifying when and how fatness triggers specific forms of medical management, healthcare injustices, social exclusions, violence, and other disparities. My understanding of the abnormal analyzes how bodies are not only evaluated in terms of normal or abnormal, but how normal is this body? This I'm quoting here from McGuire and Fritsch. How normal is this body? How amenable is it to normative enhancements and optimization? So my paper locates Ozempic, and I just use the term Ozempic throughout. You can talk about a cluster of drugs if you want to, but I just say Ozempic within constellations of techniques to manage abnormality, identifying its functions through the apparatus of ableism, making fat people healthier and thus more normal. And just ahead of the paper, I use the term obesity a lot, and I'm using that term. You can put it in scare quotes throughout, but basically I'm referring to the medical category. So it's going to be in here a lot. So this project narrows in on the role of norms of rationality that construct and maintain fat agency as compromised and abnormal, outlining how Ozempic complicates a thorny choice landscape for perspectives as diverse as fat resistance politics, so-called progressive body positivity, and mainstream medical and weight loss positions. We are in a time when everyone who is losing weight is going to be accused of using Ozempic. Responses to this give us insight into theories of the subject, rationality, and agency within a larger framework of ableist racialized fatphobia. The release of Ozempic and its use for medical management of weight loss offers an opportunity to demonstrate good neoliberal consumption habits and rational forms of bodily management for some. At the same time, it mobilizes ableist racialized fatphobia to deepen constraints on fat agency. Okay, that's all prelude. In fat studies, there are various medical turns in understanding obesity that have developed and maintained fat stigma. None more important or recent than when in 1998, overweight and obesity cutoffs reclassified millions of Americans from normal weight to overweight and from overweight to obese, changing medical management, surgical and insurance cutoffs, and baptizing an obesity epidemic. Sander Gilman, in his History of Obesity, argues that it is the, quote, most recent version of an obsession with bodily control in society and the promise of universal health through all forms of medicine, unquote. This paper works within the scholarly literature framing the obesity epidemic as a biopolitical mechanism, normalizing bodies and selves to function optimally for power, deploying biopolitical mechanisms that isolate, measure, and attempt to eradicate bodily differences. The BMI functions as a technology of power, administering life through creating and using a statistical measure from a population. Examples of how BMI cutoffs are used is there's cutoffs for hip replacements, in vitro fertilization, and various other life-saving treatments are denied on this basis. While weight loss itself is almost universally praised, since the advent of Ozempic and other GLP-1 inhibitors, concentrated attention is being paid to the method by which one has lost weight. Ozempic appears against narratives where one earns their seat at the thin table through the right kind of hard work. Given that fat people are shamed for almost anything they eat and mocked and excluded from exercise spaces, even if they do work hard, there doesn't seem to be a right way to lose weight. Ozempic, however, is an interesting contrast, given its framing as both a personal and a smart choice. Talia Welsh identifies a pervasive assumption operating that she labels the good health imperative. Here's a connection to Megan's paper. Quote, it is both rational and moral to better one's health when one can. Unquote. That's the good health imperative. Weight loss, insofar as it is understood to be necessarily health improving, is then compelled by the good health imperative. The widespread use of Ozempic by people of almost any size, and their reports of it as significantly improving their lives, demonstrate a form of what Shelley Tremaine has called biopower from below. Given this, is there a way for fat people to lose weight that could recuperate normative rationality? So is Ozempic an answer? And since proper bodily governance through reason is linked to genetic superiority and ableist white supremacy, what does this tell us about how fat figures into the differential distribution of bodily value more generally? Philosophers such as Kate Mann argue it is wrong to obligate fat people to lose weight since it doesn't work. She also offers other ways out of the moral requirement, but these don't really achieve much since it's quite clear that Ozempic and other GLP-1 inhibitors seem to work. With the existence of a clear path out of the crosshairs of fatphobia, what happens to the claims that we can't obligate someone to do something that isn't possible? Megan and I should have talked ahead of time. Those are really cool overlaps. So here, I can think of no better place to start this paper than with Oprah. So in March of 2024, just a few months after calling weight loss drugs like Ozempic the easy way out, media mogul and former longtime board member of Weight Watchers, Oprah Winfrey, hosted a full circle moment called An Oprah Special: Shame, Blame, and the Weight Loss Revolution. It's a great title. The panelists included doctors who consult with drug companies that make the GLP-1 inhibitors, the CEO of Weight Watchers, and Amy Kane, an influencer who's lost over 100 pounds using these drugs. Winfrey's weight has been central in media coverage and bullying of her. There's also tons of scholarly literature on Oprah and fat studies. And so her weight has been central in media coverage and bullying of her, as well as to her public disclosures, relatability, and wealth portfolio. Her goal for this special was to end the stigma and shaming of being overweight, but also to stop shaming and stigmatizing the method by which one loses weight. These two claims are held together in a medical paradigm, or to put it in Oprah's words, quote, "It's a disease and it's in the brain," unquote. Oprah, as an emblem of upward mobility, said she always blamed herself for her weight, but that she only now, in 2024, understands it is not a characterological flaw. Quote, "When I tell you how many times I've blamed myself, because you think, I'm smart enough to figure this out, and then you hear all along, it's you fighting your brain," unquote. Getting emotional, Oprah ended her special addressing the audience on weight and self-esteem. Quote, "For the people who think that this drug could be the relief and support and freedom that you're looking for your whole life, bless you, because there is space for all points of view," unquote. Branding Ozempic as freeing fat people from physical and mental limitations operates almost too explicitly as a form of ableist neoliberal governmentality since, again, drawing on Tremaine's work, quote, "Power operates most effectively when subjects are enabled to act," unquote. One of the most powerful claims of Ozempic as a technique of freedom is that it quiets, quote, "food noise," making food less desirable or interesting. That is, you don't even think about it. This is what Susan Bordeaux talked about in Unbearable Weight as a norm of enlightenment rationality, kind of achieved, right? Mind-body separation, and not only a mastery of desire, but a freedom from it altogether. Freedom from the flesh, thus offering fat people a clear path to forms of improved rationality. Tracy McMillan Cottom describes Oprah's special as, quote, "a harbinger of how the weight loss industry is rebranding. Obesity is a disease, and for the first time, it's not your fault," unquote. Classifying obesity as a disease officially in 2013 hasn't reduced stigma. So why would Ozempic be the missing piece that removes fault from the individual? I think this is really puzzling. One speculation comes directly from what Oprah mentioned, that the method shouldn't be stigmatized. It should be seen instead as an individual personal choice, which is also consistent with mainstream body positivity advocates who assert bodily privacy to resist fat phobia. So this is what Reagan Chastain calls the underpants rule. I have my underpants, you have your underpants, worry about yours, I'll worry about mine. Popular calls to destigmatize Ozempic use might be just due to the fact that slender people are using it and they don't want to be stigmatized. This highlights how, despite Oprah's claims, the stigma is tied to fatness, not the method per se, making destigmatizing unlikely to succeed. Indeed, it may lead to the reverse, an increase of ableist racialized fat stigma, since the very existence of Ozempic now creates a widespread belief that it is a silver bullet, leaving fat people no excuses. This is the reversal of the charge that Ozempic is also the easy way out. In discussing this with Cindy Baker, she said, in this case, fat people can't win for losing. So we're making a smart choice, but we're also taking the easy way out. Okay. Weight Watchers has taken an if you can't beat them, join them approach, purchasing a GLP-1 inhibitor provider and now designing subscription programs specific to their users. Oprah's program aims to dispel the idea that Ozempic for weight loss is a, quote, off-label use. Bringing fat further into a disease management framework is touted as an innovation in obesity treatment. So it's not off-label, it's on-label. Divorcing it here from its use for diabetes and other issues, thus telling on themselves that the cure finds its disease. Those of us with decades of obesity under our belt are inherently suspicious of innovations in obesity management. Ozempic leaves glaring the unaddressed healthcare inequities, one of which is the significant costs associated with Ozempic, running upwards of $1,500 a month. I said to Catherine Flynn Taylor recently that I thought fatties were supposed to get cheaper if we don't get diabetes. And her response to me was that in this capitalist hellscape, if we cared about properly funding healthcare system, we'd cap insulin prices. On the flip side of this, in online discussion forums for slender Ozempic users, they lament the cost because they don't meet the BMI cutoffs for prescription drug coverage, leading to even more strange bedfellows for fat activists who think that BMI is bullshit. Amy Kane, on the Oprah special, the influencer, talks about how people describe her, how people treat her better now that she's thinner, but that they also treat her children better. Previous obesity epidemic rhetoric responsibilized parents for making fat kids what the so-called secondhand obesity. But this special centers secondhand weight stigma, so being stigmatized for having a fat parent, demonstrating that innocent children are harmed by proximity to parental fat. Her other point of advocacy was that Ozempic shouldn't be thought of as cheating because it is, again, hard work, demonstrating that fat agency continues to need recuperation even after you've lost weight. So even though Ozempic has retrieved her status as civilized and under control, her former fatness marks her as susceptible to overindulgence and overactive childlike desires. This theme dominates diet and weight loss through the 20th and 21st century in terms of getting one's primitive and impulsive desires under control. This aligns with Anglo-American preoccupations with citizenship, as well as Christian morality, where the body pulls us towards sin and the rational mind moderates desires. Lynn Gerber's work on Christian weight loss and conversion therapies in evangelical communities demonstrate how bodily desires for food and sex must be disciplined, including punishment for queer sex and indulgent eating. These come together in fat sex, which both demonstrates a lesser sexual desire and evokes fear of fat reproduction, which is neo-eugenically discouraged on account of both nature and nurture. Demonstrating how obesity as a disease offers a convenient repackaging of ableism and racism. How much time do I have?
You have 10 minutes.
Perfect. Okay. I've been going fast, but hopefully everyone can get the paper with the link. Ozempic also complicates dieting subjectivity because there's several uses, one of which is the so-called vanity use, usually for slender white elites who want to use it to become more thin. These users have just demonstrated considerable fragility about their Ozempic use, arguing that they are making a private and personal choice. One by one, celebrities are being compelled to confess their use, and the assertion of bodily privacy recalls again Bordeaux's figure of the dieting self, one who is, quote, doing it only for themselves, where this me is imagined as pure, precious inner space, an authentic and personal reference point, untouched by external values and demands, a place where we live free and won't be pushed around, unquote. This defensive individualism contrasts with how invasive bodily questions are a part of fat people's everyday experiences, and lots of people's everyday experiences. In another recent discussion with Catherine Clune-Taylor, she pointed out how on a podcast, there was a white man who pridefully admitted to using Ozempic, claiming it as a kind of smartness and expediency, just owning the easy way out, demonstrating that different subject positions are available depending on whether one bears ableist racialized fat stigma. Almost any choice a fat person makes is going to be seen as an easy way out. And this is because of the figuration of rationality. Even if that choice is something sort of severe like bariatric surgery, which carries considerable risk and hard work to recover from and manage long term. In the background, there is a specific way that fat people can earn thinness. And because smart rational choosing isn't available, as evidenced by their body, whatever they're choosing is lesser. So earning thinness is for the already normatively rational through consumer choice and bodily management. I'm going to skip one paragraph. Some of the smart choice versus easy way out framing is related to public health style arguments that predate Ozempic. While many who previously made careers from stigmatizing obesity for our own good are now fighting white stigma for our own good, or what I like to call the system becoming aware of itself. Public health approaches consider fat subjects to be determined by environmental factors, contrasting Ozempic, which isolates individual management. Consider arguments for what Anna Kirkland has called the environmental approach to obesity. This progressive and sometimes feminist argument locates the primary causal factors for fatness in so-called obesogenic environments. This account highlights the role of food availability, transportation, civil engineering, lots of things. The second step in the environmental account is to emphasize the role of demographics in obesogenic environments, perhaps even taking a feminist approach advocating for poor minority women and children. Together, these steps lead to policy measures aimed to optimize the economic, physical, and food environments of disadvantaged peoples so they are less at risk of being fat, and perhaps so they become smaller. Kirkland notes that this approach aims to shift the background environment in which people make their choices by trying to make poorer environments more like elite environments. Despite occupying a lot of the same spaces, I see thin people. Thin elites are figured as capable of choosing outside of obesogenic factors in their background, whereas fat people are determined by them, overwhelming their wills. Kirkland writes, the environmental account of obesity depends on an account of political subjects as duped by capitalist forces, or big food on the one hand, and entirely self-determining on the other hand, and neither is really satisfactory. Media coverage on obesity is, quote, likely to highlight bad food choices and sedentary lifestyle as causes for obesity when discussing minority and poor people than when those groups were not discussed. So the environmental factors crop up more when we're thinking of people with compromised agency. Okay. Note that now Ozempic proponents seem to be thin people advocating for the right to make their personal choices to enhance their bodies. The environmental account should point us to collective responses to social problems, but instead tries to engineer individual choices. Once again, obesity management is aligned with individual proper consumption habits, one of which is Ozempic. So just to wrap up, Talia Welsh's analysis understands the good health imperative as a contemporary way of making us into certain kinds of selves, shaping what are essentially existential problems, such as birth, development, suffering, and death, into problems of individual bodily management. This makes sense too, considering one of the BMI's primary functions is to predict life expectancy, and life insurance is extremely difficult to obtain and exorbitantly expensive over a BMI of about 30. Depends. BMI also regulates what is considered a high-risk pregnancy, triggering considerable medical interventions, including ones that look very fervently for disability, medical interventions that one must undergo, and you must undergo them to remain a compliant patient. Higher weight is also, as I've argued elsewhere, a way of excusing forms of violence, including killing. Ozempic offers another way of thinking about the widespread acceptance and mundanity of these forms of violence, especially considering that compliance with its use is now being used to gatekeep other procedures. Revealing again that for slender, able-bodied people, Ozempic is a freeing and rational choice, but for many fat, racialized, and disabled people, it is at the same time a paternalistic, expensive, invasive intervention that is then violently framed as for their own good. So, bummer ending, but that's the conclusion. Thank you.
Thank you, Kristin. Great talk, too. You actually came in under time, so you've got a little bit of extra time. We've got 15 minutes for Q&A. Good job. So a reminder to put your questions in the Q&A if you're on the webinar, and then panelists can raise their hands as Megan has just done, or put your question in the chat.
Thank you, Kristin. That was great. I wanted to ask, I was struck by, well, lots of things you said, but especially the story of the man who was like, of course I'll take this. Like, this is the rational thing to do. You know, it's like, obviously I would take the easy way out like this. And I was just thinking a bit about like this distinction between treatment and enhancement, where if it sort of seems like, oh, this is a body hack, then it's like, oh, this is a cool thing that I can do, and of course I would do it if I have the opportunity. Like, and then like the distinction between that sort of attitude toward Ozempic and the other GLP-1s, and then the sort of like, oh, like, but you have to take it because you're fat, you know, and that sort of like, either that like sort of like, of course you have to take it because like you have a serious problem, or this is the easy way out and that's bad. So I was just like inviting, maybe if you could say a little bit about this treatment enhancement distinction and how you think it might, obviously, you know, there's not a bright line there, but if you think that assumption that there is a distinction is sort of playing into people's attitudes toward using Ozempic.
Oh, my mic is still on. Great. I'm not sure. I think it's sort of, I'm trying to point out in a way how hard work, the framing of hard work, and the connection to being a good neoliberal subject who's managing their body properly, is available and formulated in different ways, maybe depending on what your, and this is nebulous, what your sort of true body is. because there's this question of, right, it reminds me of work on cosmetic surgery in the 90s, right? Where it's like, I'm becoming the early aughts. I'm using this to become the me that I feel myself to be. Right. And so this bro who's like, yeah, you know, oh, it was great. You know, I'm not going to go to the gym every day. This is awesome. Is kind of aligning with that in a way that doesn't evoke a form or self of stigma. And so that's what I think is interesting about Amy Kane, the panelist, or just anybody really who's sort of used it to lose weight and is now in the aftermath phase of being a former. And how that is, the formerness is haunting. And so you have to, I mean, that's one of the cautionary points about it, is you have to be on it for the rest of your life. You know, it's like, well, I have to do lots of stuff for the rest of my life, you know. Don't we have to deal with our bodies for the rest of our life? I'm pretty sure that's coming. So it's just kind of interesting, right, about who my real body, what my real body is, and how that connects to the kind of agency that I'm allowed. And I'm interested in how Ozempic might offer forms of recuperative agency, but then the ways that sort of blowbacks based on one's target body. Yeah, and their reasons, whether they have reasons to use it, whether they need reasons to use it, and what those reasons are. Yeah.
Thank you. Lori.
That was great. I just you had said something early at the beginning, and I wanted to just ask about, you said something that people who lose weight, whether they used Ozempic or not, will be accused of using Ozempic. And I wonder if you could say more about that. It strikes me that there may be some other stuff packed in that I'm not aware of about sort of how people go about changing their bodies, and are some things an okay way and some things aren't. So anyway, I just wondered if you could say, like, to be accused of using Ozempic, what is it like? Is that it's like an accusation sounds like a bad thing. And so I'm just really curious.
Yeah. Well, I think there's a lot of, I think that when somebody loses weight, probably whatever their size was and then becomes, is going to be opened up to some kind of cultural, I don't want to say cultural, it's going to be available for certain forms of resentment and attack, maybe. You know, it's like, we want you to do this, but also, you know, damn them or whatever. Like I was talking about, well, you know, that we've had rain in the winter here. And I was talking to people at my exercise class about how, you know, you can get special shoes with ice grips built in. And I said, but you got to be careful about the kind of ice grip. They need to be pointy or how big they are, because I said, I have a really small friend who the picks on them aren't sharp enough to get in the ice, and she just slides all over it, even with these ice picks. And everyone there was like, oh, poor her. And, you know, and so I guess there is a kind of preloaded resentment often when you talk about losing weight, where people want to get to know what the reason, what did they do, and kind of put out some of that. It's not everybody, of course, but now, since it's like the leading, like 15 years ago, it would have been like, what's your secret? You know, and so the Ozempic is just the new version of that. It's like, oh, probably Ozempic, but it's got a layer to it around an easy way out, right? So it's like, probably Ozempic, right? So it's that. Yeah, that's what I was referring to. Tracy, your hand went up. I'm excited.
Thank you for that talk. I watched that webinar or whatever it was, that event, the Oprah event, because I'm just fascinated by it in general. But I guess where I was going, especially in relation to your last answer, where you talked about the resentment. And so sorry, I got a notification that it's going to automatically lower my hand, and that distracted me for a minute. But the general, so my worry about anything that is supposed to facilitate weight loss is that and you've talked about this, obviously, is that it reinscribes the expectation of, bodies should be slender and we should be losing weight, and this huge hold that this culture of thinness has already. And that in a way is the general source of the resentment. It's like not, it's kind of like, any, when feminists say, look, you doing this, it's bad for women. And so even though we can see the advantages, as you say, in this neoliberal context, we can see the advantages for, as an individual, taking advantage of whatever means make you more like acceptable, and more able to exercise certain forms of privilege that wouldn't otherwise be available. That when individuals make these choices, they perpetuate those oppressive structures. And so that, to me, is one of the more alarming aspects of like what nobody ever thought would happen, is the creation of a magic pill that supposedly gets you to where you're normatively speaking supposed to be. So I wonder if you could comment on that take.
Well, and I think that there's a way to brand this in a feminist way. It's sort of like, well, the patriarchy makes me feel bad about my body. That leads to like food obsession and bodily obsession. But if I take this shot, I don't have any food noise, and I'm sort of freed from that. I'm not saying that that's a feminism I ascribe to, but it reminds me of like fat as a feminist issue, and this idea of the patriarchy makes us feel bad about ourselves. We overeat when we feel bad. And so we need to resist the patriarchy so we don't feel bad, then we won't eat too much, then we'll lose weight. So it's kind of like weight loss is consistent with some of this internal feminist arguments for freeing oneself from bad body feelings. Not just sort of in the mainstream normative way of like, I'm a size 10, I want to be a size 6, like I want to be thinner, and again, it kind of reminds me of these questions of cosmetic surgery around procedural versus substantive autonomy. Can you ever make the choice to diet without, what if you think about it really hard, and what if you make all the right rational moves and you still do it? Is it an agential choice or something like this? I want to maintain that it's hard to say every choice of weight loss strengthens fat phobia and thinness, or the cult of thinness, whatever you want to call it, if some people are compelled to do it as well. So I want to, like, for example, in order to maintain your patient care for other things, in order to access surgeries. And so I think I am moved by some of the ways that this is both enabling and constraining, and that the every choice, I'll have to think about that, whether it's all reinforcing, right? It's all reinforcing that, because I don't know how we get space without it. And so I think I think I'm trying to pinpoint how this is being used to make us feel like we're freeing ourselves of something. And that might be one of the things we're freeing ourselves from. So that's, I think, more what my point is.
Okay, thank you. Yeah. Interesting. So there's a question in the chat from Shay, and it says, I'm just curious about what you would want to say about people who are disabled to need to use this because they are unable to follow other options. I would think that in those cases, they wouldn't be excused they wouldn't be praised. I feel like everybody would feel grateful that it wasn't. If we're thinking about people with severe chronic pain or people who can't walk and people who can't afford food, is this drug not a gift for people who have no other way of taking care of health needs?
Well, there's lots there. I want to see that. It's right here. There's two parts in there. People who are disabled need to use this because they're unable to follow other options. Other options for weight loss, or other options for, other options for weight loss.
Because of mobility, because of mobility issues, it seems
I would think that in those cases, they would be excused, they would be praised. Well, yeah, okay, so the praising of the use of it. I think my argument is just that the praise still comes with you're making the right choice, or you're managing your body better, but your agency is still somehow not, you're still not adequately rational because your lesser body got you there to begin with. So you're managing it, but it's still maintains stigma, is I think what I'm saying. So it's like the choice is valued, but it's still open for criticism. So forward food, this drug is not again. Okay, no other way of taking care of health needs. I think it just depends on what health needs we mean. I mean, there's lots of issues around people just not eating enough at all on these drugs, and like fainting and really like being nutrient deficient. It just sort of reminds me of a lot of concerns post certain bariatric surgeries, right, where people are just deficient in a bunch of different ways. And so I think it also just shifts what the health needs might be, but because it's you might be at a lower weight, it's fine. I think that's kind of where I would go with that.
Okay.
But yeah, I mean, if people are using it to manage a situation, to try to access care, that's important.
Hey, thank you. And we have a question in the Q&A from Helene. Thank you very much for this inspiring talk. I was thinking that stigmatizing overweight individuals is deeply rooted in Western conceptions of desert, virtue, or prudence, from ancient Greek ideals of self-restraint to Judeo-Christian views on sin, both not liking the easy way out, as it does not involve any type of self-control, virtue ethics, or resistance to temptation. What I believe is particularly contemporary in Ozempic is this amalgamation of narcissistic individuation of social media status and obsession with public image. Do you consider a reframing of concepts of aesthetic appreciation along with the critique of this particular practice?
Interesting. So in my article with Samantha Brennan in the Bloomsbury Guide to the Philosophy of Disability, we talk about Epicurus and trying to teach Stoicism as fat-bodied philosophers. And it's quite interesting how like moderation, temperance, and all of these sort of rational relationships with the bodily desire, but with bodily desires, are so overdetermined by what we take to be evidence on the body. It's really, really hard to talk about any of those kinds of frameworks without people being like, yeah, I overate, or I want the cookie, but I don't, you know, and, or I should go to the gym, you know, like he just try to talk to, you know, college age people. That's all. But I want to talk a little bit about social media because I think that there's interesting stuff going on around, you know, this is me 1 week on Ozempic. This is me 2 week on Ozempic. Like it's following social media patterns. Also there's like a very strange kind of humble brag around this freedom from desire where people are like sitting there with a plate of food and they're like, when you have to, if you know, when you have to eat and it's like, ick, I don't want to eat this, you know, because you feel nauseated on the drugs. And so I think that Ozempic has become a kind of viral spectacle as well. So, I'm not sure if that's what you mean by this social media status and obsession with public image. But
Hey,
yeah,
oh, sorry.
That's all.
I didn't mean to cut you off. We have 5 minutes left for question. Yeah, I know, in the session. And so if anyone has any questions for any of the panelists now, I'm probably not going to get to many, but if, you know, we have time for another question or two. Jonathan.
Thank you. So this may be slightly off the wall comment, but as the discussion has been progressing, particularly in your talk, Kristin, I've been thinking about sort of social attitudes to different body shapes and sizes. And you know, there's a discourse around toleration that I've heard recently. Everything's blurring into one thing now. I can't remember if it was in this conference or a conference I was at last week where someone was talking about the difference between toleration and acceptance. And that, you know, when people use the language of toleration, quite often there's an air of disapproval to it, which is, no, I have a slight disapproval of that, but I'm going to show you what a big guy I am and tolerate you, as distinct from acceptance in terms of a type of equality. And I'm wondering if even in fairly progressive circles, where we're trying to be sort of body positive, it's much more the aspects of tolerance rather than acceptance. I just wonder, Kristin, if that's your experience or you feel something has shifted from there.
So your question is, do I think even in body positive, aspirationally bodily positive spaces, that there's an air of disapproval? For sure. So one thing that Talia Welsh in an early paper talks about this idea of like there's like a limit on body positivity, right? Which is really centering around health. And this brings together, you know, expertise of, you know, Tracy, Megan, the whole panel, how these questions around the health, and that could be choices, that could be demonstrated physically, whether one is on board with the good health imperative. So it's kind of like, we'll be positive. And this is, I should never have cut this paragraph out of my paper. Everyone who clicked on the link has it. But there's a paragraph in here about the good fatty versus the bad fatty. And the good fatty is the one who, despite all their good practices, is still fat. And so we're on board, you know, so we have to be body positive about them. But if someone is unhealthy and fat, whether that's because their fat makes them unhealthy or they're unhealthy making them fat, whatever it might be, they're the bad fatty. They're not trying, you know, and so that's where you bump up against a lot of the limits of tolerance. And so Ozempic kind of complicates that, right? Because you're not doing the right kind of hard work, but you might approximate the norm. And so it's interesting. I haven't worked all of that out yet. Maybe the other panelists want to say something about that tolerance.
Okay, we have 1 minute. So maybe you should just let everybody have a minute extra for a break. Thank you, all of you. These were amazing papers. This was such a great way to start my day today. And I'm sure everyone else agrees. Awesome Q&A. And so thank you again to the panelists, and thank you to Shelley and Jonathan and the Jamie for the AV support. And I guess now the next thing is a 10-minute break before the commencement of the next session. Thanks, everybody.